Welcome to Cold War Liberals. So I've been saying all along that people on the left, socialists or liberals, to use American terminology, against Stalin, they became quite convinced that totalitarianism was not just a phenomenon of the right, that it was actually a phenomenon, perhaps especially of the left. They regarded Soviet totalitarianism as being, if anything, a greater threat, even than Nazism. And they were determined to, in the post-war period, fight against the totalitarian menace represented by the Soviet Union. We've been having a look at Arthur Koestler's picture of how, what it was which drove Russian intellectuals, Soviet intellectuals, to support the Stalinist state. We had a look at George Orwell's take on why intellectuals, on what the motivations, it may be a parody perhaps, but nevertheless a powerful drive of what the world might look like. This was Orwell's view, a world in which a small oligarchical elite basically was able to annihilate other people and this was the end of society, in effect. And the story is about how Winston Smith came to love it, so to speak. Now, how did people think you could avoid it? Well, you know, George Orwell, Winston Smith, if there is hope, it lies in the proles. And even Winston Smith probably thought, well, not so sure about that really. What can it be? They've got the force, they've got the power if they revolt, but they'll never revolt, as O'Brien told him in the interrogation scene. And basically the end of 1984 shows Winston's human spirit and Julia's human spirit being crushed out of them, in effect, by Ingsoc and by the totalitarian state of Oceania. In fact, I think the people we're talking about in this course did come to believe that if there was hope, it lay in the United States. And that's why I chose that's why I organized the book as I did, the course as I did. I mean, I only had 4 lessons, 2 lessons really describing the totalitarian challenge, 2 lessons describing how intellectuals responded to totalitarianism or Soviet totalitarianism. And I think it's fair to say people thought that with all its imperfections, with all its weaknesses, the United States was humanity's last best hope from stopping the world developing into something like Orwell's nightmare, or at any rate, some imperfect version of it. And that's why I chose the last 2 thinkers that I did. Arthur Schlesinger's Vital Center, and a very American-centric book, as I'm sure you've all realized. And Isaiah Berlin, somebody I'm particularly interested in, who I think articulates a particular form of liberalism as a response to the challenge of Soviet totalitarianism. In fact, I was quite interested to see that Jan Werner Müller, a very well-known Princeton scholar of political thought, has just been writing on that subject. So anyway, we'll be talking about Isaiah Berlin next week, but this week we were going to be talking about Arthur Schlesinger, who I'm sure most of you know already, but I just thought I would do my usual 10-minute life and times of Arthur Schlesinger. So, Arthur Schlesinger, he's the one on the right with the glasses. That was my attempt at humor for the Americans present. I'm sure you don't need to have any introduction about who the guy on the left is, and I've frankly no idea who the guy in the cap in the middle is, but there you are. Uh, a historian close to power. He was, as I've just written in my notes here, he was the son of Arthur Meyer Schlesinger, who indeed many American historians continue to admire this day as an even greater historian than Arthur, who was one of the inventors of American social history. Actually, it's quite interesting. He identified a lot with his father. His name was originally Arthur Bancroft Schlesinger, after his mother's side of the family, but he actually changed his name so he became Junior with the same name as his father. His father gave all kinds of support to his academic career in a way that I think would not really pass muster nowadays. He became a professor at Harvard when he was incredibly young. I'm going to say 26, but I might be wrong, but not much more than that. Really, his only breach with his father ever came when he went into politics with the Kennedy administration and actually renounced his Harvard professorship to stay in DC and New York as a working on political issues. I mean, I'm not going to go, obviously, give you his life story, but he emerges as a major intellectual figure after his war service, which was not particularly distinguished. He served in the OSS, which was a forerunner of the CIA, but he mostly wrote pamphlets. After the war, he became famous, really, by winning the Pulitzer Prize. I'm going to say he's the youngest winner ever. I might be wrong about that. You can probably look it up on and prove it wrong, but certainly he's one of the youngest winners ever. By his book on the Age of Jackson, which, of course, as statues tumble around the United States, is quite topical right now. And he wrote a book on Jackson, interpreting Jackson as being a progressive figure of the industrialism rather than of the frontier. I'm not an expert on that particular period in history. But more to the point, very political figure, as I say. He was a founder for Americans for Democratic Action. Some of you may even be members of Americans for Democratic Action, I don't know, which was founded in response to progressives for Progressive Citizens of America. And it's basically the split in the New Deal movement, the split between those who interpreted Roosevelt's liberalism as being something which would lead to closer relations with communism and the Soviet Union, and those who supported, in effect, the Truman Doctrine and indeed justified the Truman Doctrine as being necessary to preserve freedom. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the founders, Reinhold Niebuhr, the great Protestant scholar, and Schlesinger was one of the founders. And he was really always involved in politics, very political figure. He was a speechwriter and advisor for Adlai Stevenson in both of Stevenson's presidential campaigns. He wrote his, the 1950s, he published his second great set of books on contemporary American history of this kind, The Age of Roosevelt, which is in 3 volumes. For some reason, he never finished the 4th. I don't know why. But 3 volumes, of which the first in particular, the account of how the Great Depression happened. The Crisis of the Old Order is called. If I ever have the pleasure of teaching historical methodology to a PhD class, I shall use this book as an example of how you write narrative history. It's a fantastic, I'm not an expert. I just read it for pleasure to learn more about American history. But as a work of narrative, of building together, using narrative chapters to create a story and to provide a causal explanation of a major event in world history, it's a magnificent book. This is the first volume of the Age of Roosevelt series, which he produced at an incredible speed as well, apart from anything else. And then subsequently, as I'm sure many of you know, he became a special advisor to President Kennedy during the Kennedy administration. He was a speechwriter when Ted Sorensen would let him. He was also a special advisor on Latin American affairs, for example. He advised against the Bay of Pigs, and no one listened to him. Some people have always said that Kennedy wanted Schlesinger in the White House because sooner or later somebody was going to write a history of the Kennedy presidency, and he was on the inside track. And the end of this was written literally in much less than 1,000 days after Kennedy died. Was his book, The 1,000 Days. I don't know how many of you have ever read it. It's interesting, actually. It got him an undeserved reputation, I think, for being too close to Kennedy, being part of Camelot, being an apologist for Kennedy. And there's some truth to that. It's also a quite fantastic book, which you can feel the realism. You can feel that the guy actually was at the center of power. Even if he was not perhaps in taking the decisions, he was close to the people who were. And it gives it a sense of reality, which I think many historians don't achieve. And in my opinion, it remains the best biography or the best account of the Kennedy administration for all its admiration, excessive admiration of its subject. So this is Schlesinger. Goes on to have a very distinguished career subsequently, not least by becoming one of the first and most vocal critics of America's Vietnam policy. He wrote a short pamphlet, recommend anybody to read it. It's a fantastic piece of political polemic called The Bitter Heritage, which is really very critical of America's role in Vietnam, although, as always, it's a bit more tender towards Kennedy than he was to Lyndon Johnson, but anyway. Okay, so this brings us to the book we're going to be discussing, The Vital Center. And just a little bit of background on this. After The Age of Jackson, his big successful book was indeed The Vital Center. It was a book appeared in 1949, height of the Cold War, and argued in a very dramatic fashion, as you can see from the illustration that I've found, that freedom, the struggle for freedom, had to become a fighting faith. It's an attack on the right, an attack also, though, on the progressive left, on Henry Wallace and what he calls the new dough-facers, and we can talk about that in a moment. It's an attack on the American Communist Party, which it probably seems incredible for some people nowadays that one existed, but at the time it did. And of course, parts of the book you can almost interpret as being, inverted commas, McCarthyite in this debate. And above all, it was a call for a revival of American radicalism. I only really gave you the last 3 chapters to read, but I think it's fair to say it's an attack on the conservative right and big business. It's basically, in the earlier chapters of the book, he has a chapter on the failure of the right. He basically says, business is small-minded, it's in favor of subsidies for business, but wants the free market for anybody else. It never seems to understand that we are anything other than producers and consumers, but in fact, it has no sense of community, no sense of anything other than individuals working for the profit margin, and that we just simply cannot expect the right to provide any kind of, ideology, any kind of idea, any kind of ideal which might be used to counteract communism and the threat of communist totalitarianism. On the other hand, and this is really interesting, it's a real attack on the progressive left, and in particular the figure of Henry Wallace. Now, I'm really interested in this because I've actually been writing about this in recent times, because not many people know that Henry Wallace, at the height of the Cold War, at the beginning of the Cold War, April 1947, came to Britain and was greeted by millions and millions of people. Listened to his radio broadcast. Thousands of people flocked to listen to him. And he preached the doctrine, basically, of one worldism. that the United States had to reach out for the Soviet Union. The United States had to make a new deal for the world. The United States, and this was had an enormous impact. It's passed almost unnoticed in the literature on the Cold War, and I'm actually writing what will be a very substantial article on this, going backwards and forwards. And it was very influential in Britain at the time, and in particular among the left of the British Labour Party, who counteracted Wallace's view of the world to the position being taken by the British government, which was basically in support of the Truman Doctrine. Now, excuse me if I go into the background for this. Now, what Schlesinger says, Schlesinger actually intervened in the debate that was caused by Wallace's visit to England in April 1947 by writing to the Times to attack him and saying, well, you know, this guy is basically, no doubt, in an innocent way, helping global communism. And in his autobiography, Schlesinger's a bit shamefaced about this, but he doesn't change his basic criticism of Wallace in the Vital Centre. It's a bit less ad hominem, but he's still essentially sticks to the same criticism, which is that the progressives, the people who are arguing that you can make a deal with the Soviet Union, that you can achieve an accord, that you can, in some way or other, support or go along with Soviet totalitarianism, really haven't understood what they're talking about. And they're dough-facers. No, dough-face progressivism, the faith of the present-day fellow traveler, may be defined briefly as progressivism kept alive by the main force in face of all the lessons of modern history. He's basically saying, you know, people have still got an optimistic view of the world. They're liberals. They have a strong utopian streak. They believe that the world can be made better, and we can even persuade the Soviet Union to change its ways. This is the essence of his criticism, and he thinks this is complete nonsense. And he cites, in fact, Wallace's, the way in which the Communist Party of the United States manipulated Wallace's campaign in the 1948 election campaign as proof of this. Schlesinger, in fact, chapter 6 of this book appeared in Life, which was part of the Luce Press, L-U-C-E, Henry Booth Luce, as a critique of the communist presence in American life. So what's he arguing in return? He's arguing for a revival of American radicalism, a revival for a revival of American idealism, but not utopianism. Idealism tempered by realism in a common cause of freedom. This is the essence of it. And trying to widen and deepen the democratic middle ground. And he says, who must occupy the vital center? The non-communist left and the non-fascist right must collaborate to keep society truly free. And in the last 3 chapters of the book, having made this analysis of the United States, as I say, United States very much seen as the last best hope against totalitarianism, Schlesinger's saying, okay, it is the last best hope, but there is a powerful conservative tendencies in the United States, conservative in the worst sense of that word, reactionary, small-minded. There's a lot of misguided utopianism. We've got to have a doctrine of realistic social reform which can animate people, right? This is the gist of his argument.